close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world where your doctor looks you in the eye, completely calm, completely certain, and tells you that the reason you are dying is because you simply have too much life inside you. Too much blood, too much vitality. The cure, he explains with the quiet confidence of a man who has done this 1,000 times, is to let some of it go. This was not a fringe belief. This was not the opinion of a village eccentric muttering over candles in a dark corner. This was mainstream medicine. This was the consensus. And for over 1,000 years, across kingdoms and continents, from peasant cottages to palace bedchambers, it was treated as unquestionable truth. To understand why, you have to travel back to ancient Greece, where a physician named Galen built a medical framework so elegant, so internally consistent, and so utterly wrong that it dominated human healing for more than 14 centuries. According to Galen, the human body was governed by 4 invisible fluids called humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was simply a matter of balance. When those 4 humours existed in perfect harmony, you thrived. When one of them tipped too far in any direction, you became sick. The logic was clean. The execution was catastrophic. Because here is the problem with invisible fluids. You cannot see phlegm misbehaving inside a liver. You cannot watch yellow bile staging a quiet rebellion in the stomach. But blood you could see. Blood was tangible, dramatic, and deeply convincing. And so blood became the humour everyone blamed first. The villain of the 4. The fluid most likely to be declared excessive, rebellious, and in urgent need of removal. Enter the lancet, a small, sharp tool, elegantly simple in design, terrifying in purpose. Medieval physicians would select a vein, most often in the arm, sometimes in the neck, occasionally in places that make modern readers wince, and slice it open with practiced precision. Ceramic bowls were placed beneath to catch what poured out. There were charts, beautifully illustrated, meticulously organized charts, explaining which vein corresponded to which organ, which illness, which humour. If medieval medicine was going to be catastrophically wrong, it was at least going to be catastrophically wrong with excellent documentation. And then the patient would begin to fade. The blood would drain, the colour would leave their face, their breathing would slow, their eyelids would grow heavy, and sometimes they would lose consciousness entirely, and the physician would nod, satisfied. The excess was leaving the body, the humours were rebalancing. This was not alarm, this was progress. The cruelty of it is not that these doctors were monsters. They were not. They were educated men working faithfully within the only framework they had ever been taught. The true tragedy was something far more haunting than cruelty. It was confidence, pure, unshakable, well-meaning confidence, pointed in entirely the wrong direction, for 1,000 years, one bleeding bowl at a time. If the lancet was medieval medicine's blunt declaration of war against the human body, then the leech was its attempt at diplomacy, softer, more organic, more alive, quite literally than a sharpened piece of metal. And in the grand, sprawling theatre of medieval healing, the leech played a role so significant, so deeply trusted, that it earned something very few medical instruments ever truly receive. It earned a nickname. Physicians in medieval England were not always called doctors. Quite often, with a kind of poetic simplicity that history rarely gets credit for, they were called leech weeders, or simply leeches. The tool and the man who wielded it had become one and the same. To understand why a small, slimy, blood-drinking worm became one of the most respected figures in a medieval sick room, you have to return to that familiar villain, the humour, the balance, the ever-present terror of too much blood pooling in the wrong place, thickening in the wrong organ, staging a quiet mutiny inside a body that had absolutely no way to defend itself against its own doctor. The logic of the leech, if you follow it charitably, is almost reasonable. Where the lancet was aggressive, dramatic, a knife against a vein, the leech was considered precise, controlled, natural. You placed the creature on the skin above the troubled area, and it would feed, slowly and deliberately, drawing out exactly what it needed, and no more. No charts required, no bowls. The leech, in theory, was self-regulating, a living instrument that knew when to stop. They were farmed in shallow ponds across Europe, harvested carefully, stored in jars of cool water, and transported to apothecaries and physicians who kept them ready the way a modern clinic keeps bandages. There was an entire economy built around them. Leech collectors waded into marshes with bare legs, allowing the creatures to attach naturally, then peeled them off and sold them by the bundle. It was unpleasant work. It was also, by medieval standards, essential work. The application itself was methodical. Physicians would sometimes score the skin lightly to encourage feeding, or coat the area in blood or sugar water to attract the creature's attention. Once attached, a single leech could consume several times its own body weight. When it finally dropped away, swollen and satisfied, the wound would often continue bleeding for hours, because leech saliva contains a remarkable anticoagulant that prevents clotting. Medieval doctors saw this prolonged bleeding not as a warning sign but as confirmation. The treatment was working. The body was releasing what it no longer needed. What makes the leech story stranger still is this. Unlike so many medieval remedies that were simply fiction dressed in confidence, leeches are not entirely without value. Modern medicine uses them still in microsurgery and reattachment procedures in cases where blood pooling threatens newly repaired tissue. The creature was never the problem. The theory behind it was a useful tool, borrowed by a broken framework, applied to patients who deserved so much better than the world they were born into. There is a particular kind of trust that exists between a sick person and the one who promises to heal them. It is one of the most vulnerable exchanges in all of human experience. You are frightened. You are in pain. You do not understand what is happening inside your own body, and someone steps forward, calm and certain, and says, "I know what will help. Take this, drink this, eat this." And because fear has a way of making even the most unlikely things seem worth trying, you do. In medieval Europe, that moment of desperate trust was filled with some of the most extraordinary substances in the history of human imagination. And when we say extraordinary, we mean that with the full weight of what the word can carry, because medieval pharmacology was not simply herbs and honey and the occasional willowbark tea. It was a world where crushed gemstones were stirred into wine and prescribed for heart ailments, where the dung of various animals, dogs, pigeons, and goats among them, was applied directly to infected wounds, where urine, warm and fresh, was considered a perfectly reasonable mouthwash, a wound cleanser, and in certain traditions, a diagnostic tool you simply tasted to determine what was wrong. The recipes survive. That is perhaps the most startling thing of all. Medieval medical texts, some of them beautifully illustrated, carefully copied by monks in candlelit scriptoriums, contain remedies written down with the same seriousness a modern physician might use to note a dosage. For a fever, take the bile of a boar mixed with the fat of a bear and apply to the chest. For a toothache, burn a candle close to the gum until a worm falls out, because the worm, obviously, is the cause. For failing eyesight, a poultice of pigeon blood applied to the eyelids. For melancholy, powdered gold dissolved in rose water, assuming, of course, you could afford the gold. What guided these prescriptions was rarely random cruelty and almost always a kind of internal logic that made perfect sense within the world medieval thinkers inhabited. Many remedies were built on the doctrine of signatures, the belief that nature had coded its own cures into the appearance of plants and animals. A plant with red sap must treat blood disorders. A root shaped like a human leg must strengthen the legs. A yellow flower must address ailments of the liver, because the liver was associated with yellow bile. And yellow things speak to yellow things. It was a language of resemblance, a poetry of healing, written in leaves and roots and the colours of the natural world. Religion threaded through everything. Certain ingredients held power not because of chemistry, but because of holiness. Prayers were to be spoken over preparations. Specific remedies could only be gathered at dawn, or under a particular phase of the moon, or by a person who had fasted and confessed. The sacred and the medicinal were not separate categories, they were the same category viewed from slightly different angles, and underneath all of it, always, was that same human impulse that makes the story both painful and deeply sympathetic, the desire to help, the refusal to stand still in the face of suffering. Even when the tools were wrong, the reaching was real. Picture the most frightening medical procedure you can imagine. Now, remove the anesthesia. Remove the sterile environment. Remove the century of accumulated surgical knowledge, the precise instruments, the monitors tracking your heart, the team of specialists watching every incision with trained and careful eyes. Strip all of that away and place yourself on a wooden table in a dimly lit room somewhere in medieval Europe, with a man standing over you who, just this morning, was cutting someone's hair. This was not a metaphor. This was not an exaggeration designed to make the past feel more dramatic than it was. The barber-surgeon was one of the most common medical figures in the medieval world, a man whose professional identity split cleanly down the middle between cosmetic tidiness and catastrophic intervention. He could trim your beard in the morning and amputate your leg by afternoon, and both services would be listed with equal seriousness among his professional offerings. The red and white striped pole that still marks barbershops in many parts of the world today is not a cheerful decoration. It is a relic, the red for blood, the white for bandages. The pole itself representing the stick a patient would grip during the procedure to encourage the veins to swell. The division between physicians and surgeons in medieval Europe was not simply professional, it was philosophical, and it was enforced with considerable snobbery. Physicians were educated men, university-trained, Latin-speaking, theorists of the humours who considered the actual cutting of flesh to be beneath their dignity. Surgery was manual labour. It was messy and physical and uncomfortably close to the work of butchers, and so it was handed downward to the barbers, to the wound healers, to the men whose formal training was often nothing more than apprenticeship and observation, and the grim education of repeated failure. What they were asked to do was extraordinary. On battlefields across Europe, barber-surgeons worked in conditions that would be unimaginable in any modern operating room. Arrows had to be extracted from living tissue. Limbs shattered beyond repair had to be removed quickly, because speed was the closest thing they had to mercy. Amputation was performed with saws, the bone cut through as fast as possible, while assistants held the patient still. Survival depended less on technique than on the patient's own constitution, and a great deal of fortune. And then came the wound treatment, which was, in its own particular way, almost as dangerous as the injury itself. For centuries, surgeons believed that wounds needed to suppurate, to produce pus, in order to heal properly. Pus was not alarming. Pus was considered laudable, a sign the body was expelling its corruption. To encourage this, boiling oil was poured directly into fresh wounds. The screaming, we can only assume, was considerable. It was a French surgeon named Ambroise Paré who eventually, almost by accident, discovered that wounds left clean and dressed simply healed better than those treated with boiling oil. He ran out of oil during a battle. He expected his untreated patients to die. They recovered faster than the others. Even in a world built on confident wrongness, occasionally mercy stumbled onto the right answer. There is a moment when you are truly sick, when medicine alone does not feel like enough. When the remedies have been tried and the healers have come and gone, and the fever still burns and the pain still sits heavy in your chest, and something deeper inside you reaches out toward whatever it believes might be listening. This is not weakness. This is one of the oldest and most human impulse. that exists, and in medieval Europe, that impulse was not kept separate from medicine. It was medicine, completely, officially, and without apology. To understand the medieval sick room, you have to first understand that the boundary we draw today between the spiritual and the scientific simply did not exist. It had not been drawn yet. The human body was not merely a biological machine to be repaired with the correct tools. It was a soul wrapped in flesh, existing within a divine order, subject to forces both natural and supernatural. And illness was rarely understood as purely physical. Sickness could be punishment. It could be test. It could be the quiet work of demons pressing against the walls of a weakened spirit. And if those were the possible causes, then prayer, confession, and the intervention of saints were not alternatives to medicine. They were the most logical first response. The Church did not simply influence medieval medicine. In many ways, it was medieval medicine. Monasteries were the hospitals of their age. Monks copied and preserved the ancient medical texts, grew the medicinal herb gardens, and tended to the sick in infirmary wards built along the cool stone corridors of religious houses across Europe. The physician and the priest existed in the same building, served the same patients, and operated within the same understanding of what a human being actually was. Relics were prescribed with the same authority that a modern doctor might prescribe medication. A fragment of bone from a martyred saint, sealed in a golden case and pressed against a swollen limb, was not considered superstition by the people who used it. It was considered effective. Pilgrimage to holy shrines was recommended for ailments that resisted other treatment. The sick travelled enormous distances, weak and suffering, to kneel before the tomb of a saint and ask for the healing that earthly remedies had failed to provide, and sometimes, in ways that historians still discuss carefully and doctors still find uncomfortable to dismiss entirely, they returned home better than when they left. Holy water was applied to wounds, specific psalms were to be recited over certain preparations, amulets inscribed with sacred words were worn against the skin above the troubled organ. The Mass was said. Candles were lit, sins were confessed, because sin and sickness were understood to share a common root, and absolution was therefore a form of treatment. What emerges from all of this is not a portrait of ignorance, though ignorance was certainly present. What emerges is a portrait of a world that refused to treat the body as separate from everything else that made a person who they were, their faith, their community, their relationship with something larger than themselves. In stripping that away, modern medicine gained precision. What it lost is a question worth sitting with quietly in the dark for a little while. There are images from history that burn themselves into the imagination and refuse to leave. The silhouette of a figure moving through a darkened street, long black robes trailing the ground, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and a face that is not quite a face at all, but something stranger and more unsettling. A long curved beak, like a bird of prey frozen mid-transformation, glass eyes catching the weak light of a city that is quietly, systematically, dying. This is the plague doctor, and once you have seen the image, something about it stays with you, because it sits at the precise intersection of the eerie and heartbreaking. Here was a person walking toward the thing everyone else was running from, dressed in the process like a nightmare. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, carried on merchant ships from the east, slipping into the east. E-port of Messina in Sicily like a secret no one had asked to receive. Within 4 years it had moved across the continent with a patience and thoroughness that defied every attempt to outrun it. Towns emptied, harvests rotted in fields with no one left to bring them in. The smell of death became so constant in certain cities that people stopped noticing it the way you stop hearing a sound that never stops. Between a third and half of Europe's entire population was gone before the worst of it passed, and through all of it, the plague doctors walked. They were not, it should be said, the most experienced or celebrated physicians of their age. Many of the doctors hired specifically to treat plague victims were young or newly qualified, or simply the ones willing to accept a contract that more seasoned physicians had quietly declined. Cities paid them directly, because plague doctors were municipal employees, public servants of a particularly grim variety, contracted to treat the sick regardless of their ability to pay. It was, in its way, one of the earliest forms of public health care, funded by desperation, staffed by the brave and the foolish, in roughly equal measure. The iconic costume was not merely theatrical, it was, by the understanding of its time, a sophisticated piece of protective technology. The beak was filled with aromatic substances, dried flowers, herbs, spices, camphor and vinegar-soaked sponges, because the dominant theory of plague transmission was miasma, bad air. The belief that disease travelled not through contact or through creatures too small to see, but through the very atmosphere itself, corrupted by rotting matter and divine displeasure. If you filtered what you breathed through enough rosemary and cloves, the theory went, the poisoned air could not reach you. The waxed robes prevented contaminated matter from touching the skin. The glass yes, sealed the face completely. It did not work. Not because the doctors lacked intelligence, but because the enemy was invisible in a way they had no framework to understand. The flea on the rat on the ship had no place in their model of the world. And so they walked their rounds, tapping patients with long wooden canes to avoid direct touch, recording the dead, occasionally bleeding the living, and breathing deeply through a beakful of lavender, while the world came quietly apart around them. Every revolution in human understanding begins the same quiet way, not with a dramatic announcement, not with a single genius standing in a shaft of golden light, suddenly seeing everything clearly. It begins with a moment of hesitation, a pause, a physician standing over a patient, remedy in hand, thinking for just a fraction of a second longer than usual, and asking a question that the framework he was trained in never taught him to ask. What if this is making things worse? That question is harder to ask than it sounds. It requires a particular kind of courage that history rarely celebrates. The courage to doubt not your enemies or your rivals, but the very foundation of everything you were taught to believe. The physicians of medieval Europe were not stupid men. Many were among the most educated people of their age, fluent in multiple languages, deeply read, capable of extraordinary intellectual precision within the system they inhabited. The system itself was the problem. And systems, especially ones reinforced by centuries of tradition and institutional authority and the quiet comfort of consensus, do not surrender easily. Change came in pieces. Ambroise Paré, the French barber-surgeon who ran out of boiling oil on a battlefield and discovered almost by accident that clean wounds healed better than scalded ones, did not immediately overturn surgical practice across Europe. He wrote about what he had seen. He published, he argued, he was dismissed, then debated, then gradually, reluctantly believed. Andreas Vesalius, a Flemish anatomist working in the 16th century, began dissecting human bodies with a precision and honesty that revealed Galen's ancient diagrams to be riddled with errors. Galen, it turned out, had based much of his human anatomy on the dissection of animals, pigs and monkeys primarily, and then assumed the details transferred. They did not. Vesalius showed the world what a human body actually looked like on the inside, and the world was not entirely grateful. Challenging Galen felt, to many, like challenging scripture. William Harvey mapped the circulation of blood in 1628, demonstrating that blood did not simply pool and stagnate in the organs as had been believed for centuries, but moved continuously, driven by the heart in a closed loop that never needed topping up or draining. The entire theoretical foundation of bloodletting collapsed with that single discovery. And yet, bloodletting continued. In some places, for another 200 years, because knowledge and practice are not the same thing, and the distance between understanding something and changing the behavior built around the old understanding can stretch across generations. The germ theory of disease arrived in the 19th century, carried forward by Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, and it finally named the invisible enemy that plague doctors had walked toward in beaked masks and waxed robes without ever being able to see: bacteria, microorganisms, life too small for the naked eye, operating in a world parallel to the one humans could perceive, causing more suffering than any imbalance of humours had ever explained. And here, at the end of this long and sometimes agonizing story, is the question that every chapter has been quietly building toward. We look back at medieval medicine and we wince. We shake our heads. We feel the comfortable superiority of people who know better. But the doctors who bled their patients were certain too. The plague doctors in their beaked masks were doing their very best. The barber-surgeons pouring boiling oil into wounds believed, with complete sincerity, that they were helping. Certainty has always been medicine's most dangerous ingredient, and the most honest thing modern medicine ever learned was not a cure, not a vaccine, not a surgical technique. It was a single humbling instruction written into the oldest of medical traditions, finally understood in its fullest weight. First, do no harm, not because harm is always obvious, but because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who is absolutely sure they know exactly what they are doing.